Hey, everybody, this is Kenny. Welcome back to another edition of the Leading from the Middle podcast. This is the podcast for middle managers who want to develop themselves, develop their teams, and improve their results. I am so blessed that I have these amazing leaders that are so giving of their time that will come on and give advice that hopefully, actually, I'm not going to say hopefully, that I know you can use and you can put in place. Today, I had the honor of having the CEO of Trust Unlimited, Darryl Stickel, come on today, and he talked about trust and what are some of the pitfalls when trust is broken. And is all lost when trust is broken? Can it be rebuilt ever? You want to stay tuned and listen to his story and listen to all the great advice that he gave us. Let's get at it.
This episode is brought to you by Kitcaster. Kitcaster books you on top podcasts. How do funded startup founders attract prospects and talent? Podcast interviews. How do entrepreneurs with exits find new deals? Podcast interviews. How do C-suite execs differentiate in crowded markets? Podcast interviews. Kitcaster books you on top podcasts. Click the link in the show notes for a special offer. Celebrate good conversation.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to the Leading from the Middle podcast. And I have to tell you, this gentleman that I have with us today is going to talk about trust, probably a couple of other things because he is a leader. But trust from a leadership perspective is one of those things that we really take for granted these days. And I love what he's doing. And I can't wait for him to now, for these next 30 minutes or so, give you leaders out there his advice and his very specific advice on things that he's doing when it comes to helping leaders become more aware of trust and doing some specific things. So without further ado, I want to get right to the CEO of Trust Unlimited. Darryl Stickel has joined me today. Darryl, it is so great to have you on, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Better now that I'm hanging out with you, Ken.
Awesome. Hey, let's jump right in because I can't wait to get some of your advice here. But I want to start with your backstory because as I was doing research and listening to a few other podcasts that you've been on, I got to say, there's got to be something in your background that has caused you to really be so passionate about this topic. So tell us your backstory and what's led you to where you are right now.
Yeah, that's a lot of times our lives make sense in retrospect,
Yes.
right? And if I look back at the story of my life, it feels like I was destined to be where I am now. That there was an intent for this for some reason. So I grew up in a small town in northern Canada. Conditions were pretty harsh. You know, it was not unusual for it to be minus 40 in the middle of winter. And it was a small community. We were fairly isolated. There were about 12,000, 13,000 people when I grew up there.
Mm-hmm.
And so people had to pull together. And there was this sense of community that we had. Now I had some experiences growing up that were challenging, you know, and sometimes a hard road's a good teacher. Um, you know, my father was involved in an automobile accident when I was 7. Lost his leg, cracked his pelvis, broke his hip, crushed a couple of vertebrae in his back, and he was in pain for the rest of his life. And that had an impact. You know, he self-medicated with alcohol, and it led to some struggles between him and I. We had similarities and differences, and struggled to sort of figure out how to cope with those. And then when I was 17, I was playing hockey. I was playing junior. I was a junior player. We were playing in a junior B league, and I was attacked by a fan of the club and beaten unconscious. And according to one of my teammates, I stopped breathing 3 times on the way to the hospital.
Wow.
And so I ended up with a very severe concussion, you know, and it's in the mid 80s, early to mid 80s, when we don't really know much about those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm legally blind. I knew my vision was declining, that I'd have to train myself to think for a living if I wanted to be independent and survive. And now all of a sudden I had the attention span of a fruit fly, you know, and I'd done well in school, and then all of a sudden I was failing everything. And so it was a traumatic experience.
Yes.
And it gave me a level of empathy for others that I think is uncommon, Ken. And so when I eventually went to university, I'd be sitting on the bus and somebody would sit next to me and say, I'm just really having a hard time.
Wow.
For some reason, people just open up to me.
Yes.
And I wanted to understand what that was, and there was also a part of me that thought if this is going to keep happening, I should probably get paid for this.
Mm.
Um, you
Mm.
know, so so I went and did an undergraduate degree in psychology, worked with families in crisis, troubled teens, worked on crisis lines, all those things to try to hone those skills and understand them at a deeper level. And then I realized that a lot of the families I was working with were just doing the best they could.
Mhm.
And it was a struggle for them to get from A to B, even if you could see a relatively straight path for them. And I thought this will drive me insane.
Mm.
And so I changed my plan from becoming a clinical psychologist to doing something else. And I ended up working in public admin. I did a master's degree in public administration and was working in native land claims. And they would ask me these deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will the province look like 50 years after claims are settled? And the last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us?
Mm.
I thought, wow, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of these long-term disputes, right? Why are they so resilient? Why do we have such a hard time getting along sometimes? And so I went to Duke and wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments
Mhm.
and, tried to develop an insight about how people make the decision to trust. Why is it hard sometimes? And developed a full, robust model for, how the trust decision gets made and included things that hadn't been really included before. Um, a lot of the research doesn't include context, which once we start to include context, we start to understand why we sometimes trust people without knowing anything about them.
Mhm.
We go to a doctor's office, we go to a restaurant, we get in a cab, we get on a plane. You believe the pilot's made it through all 12 steps of that substance abuse program. Um, and so including context, including notions of vulnerability, most of the research treats trust like a dichotomous variable, like it's either present or absent. And that's where our heads go too, right? Is we either trust someone or we don't. And the reality is we trust some people more than others.
Mhm.
And so we can talk about depths of relationship and then looking at perceived outcomes, because a lot of the literature treats trust like a one-shot event. And we have multiple exposures to folks and we learn from our exchanges. And you know and then in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we like or dislike someone else.
Mhm.
So 99% of the trust research treats people like rational actors. And if you've ever had children or dated someone, you know that people aren't always rational,
Mm.
right? And
Mhm.
so,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So that's kind of the background.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. What an amazing, amazing story. Man, I am so sorry that that happened to you. And boy, oh boy, but it's taken you to a place that I'm glad it's taken you to for sure.
yeah,
Yeah, wow, wow. Let let me take a little bit of a step now forward, Daryl. How would you define trust? Because I loved everything you said, and you're going to a place that a lot of people don't think about. How would
right.
you define trust?
So I use a definition that was fairly common amongst academics, but it's trust is the willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave.
Mm,
And
mm,
so there's elements of uncertainty and vulnerability in that definition.
mhm,
And for me, when we're deciding to trust someone, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. The first is how likely am I to be harmed,
mhm,
which is perceived uncertainty. And the second is if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt, which
mm,
is perceived vulnerability.
mhm, mhm.
And I think those things multiply together. So it's uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. And if we go beyond that threshold, then we don't trust. If we're beneath it, then we do.
Mhm,
Which makes building trust actually fairly simple. It's where does uncertainty come from and how do we take steps to reduce it?
mhm.
And where does vulnerability come from and how do we take steps to help the other person manage that?
Mm, mm. Wow. Wow. That is a great definition. Um, and as you were talking in my mind, I'm thinking about that middle manager, right? That
Mm,
hired that 19, 20-year-old kid. What are, let's start there. What are some hints and tips for them? And maybe they don't trust, right, the leaders above them at that time, but
right.
still have to, hire people and bring them in. and now you've got this 19, 20-year-old kid that now you're entrusted with what might be their career. What are some
Right.
tips, Darryl, on where leaders can start to build this awareness that exactly you're talking about?
Man, and Ken, you're just nailing it. That's a great question. So for me, it's about sharing the challenges, right? Because leadership is hard, particularly when we're stuck in the middle and we've got constraints. I talk about context. Context is the rules of the game, the formal and informal mechanisms of social control that constrain my behaviors. And if I'm in the middle, that means that there's people above me making decisions that I don't have control over. And there's, things going on within the organization and things going on within the world that I don't have control over. And I'm trying to manage the best I can. And at the same time, I'm trying to get that young new hire on the right page, trying to get them, learning and growing and developing within the organization. And I want their buy-in. I want them to be engaged. I want them to want to learn and
Mm-hmm.
grow and develop with the organization. And, if they're successful, I'm successful. And so the more senior we become, the less direct control we have over outcomes, the more we depend on the people that work for us to reach our goals and objectives.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, really, it's about starting to share some of those challenges, acknowledging that, hey, when I first started, I made lots of mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. It's okay. I still make mistakes, and owning up to that. Being able to acknowledge, hey, here's what my goals and objectives are. Here's what the constraints are. Here's what I have control over. Here's what I don't. We interpret the world through stories. And so if I start sharing the story with those that I'm working with, it means that they're not making up their own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the challenges we see in low trust environments is there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of guessing about what's going on, and people are making up stories all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so if we actually become part of that creation of the narrative, then there's a much better chance we're going to have alignment.
Yeah, man, oh man, I love that. And I have this jotted down here to ask you, and you really nailed it. Um, it's not enough. I love the transparency thing that you're saying, right? That is so
Yeah.
to be able to tell your own story, so people can relate. And I think leaders miss that at times. But I've heard a lot of leaders say, and this is where trust I've seen broken a lot, is where a leader will say, hey, listen, this is not going to happen, absolutely not going to happen, and then a month later it happens, and they say, oh well, the priorities change. Uh,
Right.
and so what? How do you rebuild it? Because that may be
Mm.
true at times, but how do you rebuild it? Is it irreparable at that point?
Okay, that's a question I get fairly often is once it's broken, can we rebuild trust?
Hmm.
And the answer has to be yes. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any left in the world,
Yeah,
right? Because
sure,
I make mistakes all the time,
absolutely.
right? And if it was a fatal flaw, then I wouldn't have, my kids wouldn't talk to me, my friends wouldn't talk to me, no one would be reaching out to ask me for advice or having conversations with me because there wouldn't be any trust left. And so, absolutely, we can rebuild it.
Mhm.
And you raise a great point, because I'm going to backtrack for just a second here. It's a
Mhm.
bit of a segue, but I think it's important. Uncertainty comes from two places, right? Remember, I said uncertainty times vulnerability gives us risk.
Yes.
Uncertainty comes from two places. It comes from us as individuals, and it comes from the context that we're embedded in.
Mhm.
And so, for us as individuals, there are three levers that we can pull. There's benevolence, integrity, and ability.
Mm.
And benevolence is a belief you've got my best interest at heart
Mhm.
and that you'll act in my best interest. Integrity is, do I follow through on the promises I make, and do my actions line up with the values that I express?
Mhm.
And abilities, do I have the competence to do what I say I'm going to do? Now, we all have the ability to build trust. Some are just better than others.
Mm.
Those who aren't very good have a lever that they pull, and usually it's the ability lever. I have this much experience. This is my role within or rank within the organization. I have these kinds of credentials. Those are the levers we like to pull.
Mm.
Those who are better have multiple levers. Those who are really good have multiple levers and know when to pull which one.
Mm.
Now, you articulate a story about the integrity lever failing, right? Where we've made a commitment to someone and then we've failed to follow through because priorities have changed or the structures have changed or we're moving in a different direction. The world has shifted on us.
Mm-hmm.
That's not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly for those who are stuck in the middle, right? Because they often don't have complete control over outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so what I tell people is promise effort, not outcome, because we don't always have control over
Wow.
the outcome.
Wow.
We do have control over what we're going to do. And where we tend to fall down, is when we make promises about an outcome that we don't have control over, and then someone else decides things are going to change for us,
Mm-hmm.
or the world changes on us. And the world's changing really fast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so integrity gets to be a harder and harder lever to pull. And now, can we recover if things have gone wrong? Absolutely we can.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we start by saying, look, I know that this is the promise that I made you. And things shifted outside my control. I'm really sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in order to try and you had expectations. And so we start talking about the narrative that the other person has, trying to engage empathy and say, this is how that harmed you. You had expectations, you had goals and dreams about what that change was going to look like for you. You had envisioned it. And, I didn't realize that it wasn't going to happen when I made the commitment.
Mm-hmm.
But now that I do, how do we take steps forward so that that doesn't happen again?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so if it was around some kind of promotion or some kind of benefit that the person was going to receive, then for me as the leader, I would say, I need you to help me justify that.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's what that's going to take from my end, but here's what I need from you for us to make it work. And there's no guarantee that it's going to happen, but this is the best chance.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's a promotion, it means that I'm, and here we talk about benevolence, somebody's best interest at heart. If you come to me and you want to get a promotion and a pay raise, then I need to be able to say to you, okay, then I need to be able to hold you to a higher standard. I need to be able to make you more transparent, put more responsibility on you. I need you to be acting like you're already in that role so that people can envision you in that role and I can make the case for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I'll be best positioned to make the argument on your behalf.
Mm. Love it. Yeah. Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow. That's so awesome. I'm thinking also my son works in ministry in the inner city of Cleveland, and he
Okay.
works with a lot of kids that come from broken homes. And one of the things that he told me a while ago was, it's hard for me to get these kids to trust me because they don't trust anybody else. They don't
Right.
trust, they come from a broken home. People have let them down before they've walked in the door, to see me. How do leaders pick up on that or even know that? And then once they know that, what are some things that they can do?
Mm. I feel for your son because I used to work with street kids and that kind of stuff. And
Mhm.
there's a similar narrative, and it's really about setting boundaries and being consistent.
Mhm.
Right. So for me, really, it's overwhelmingly about reducing uncertainty.
Mhm.
Um, and it's about including the other person in the conversation as much as they'll let you.
Mhm.
And so, I work with families and we'll talk about benevolence. I'll say, who here has their kid's best interest at heart? And, all the hands go up, right? Because of course they do.
Right.
But when I flip that question and I say, how many of your kids would say that? It's about a third.
Mhm.
And it's somewhat hesitant, right?
Mhm.
And so if it's not obvious in a place where it's supposed to be obvious, how do we make it land? Because so many times I'll talk to leaders about those three levers. And in the book that I wrote, I've got 10 levers that I talk about.
Mhm.
Well, three of them are benevolence, integrity, and ability. The fourth one is context, and that shows up in the uncertainty bucket. And I'll talk to them about those levers, and they'll say, well, I pull all those. And I'll say, says who? Right? Because if I tell you I'm benevolent, that doesn't carry as much freight as if you say, yeah, Darryl, I think you're benevolent.
Yes. Yes.
Right. And so I really want your listeners to actually take this content away and change behavior and have success and lead powerful, productive lives. That's what benevolence sounds like. And if it lands, right, if I'm giving them things that they can actually do something about,
Mhm.
steps they can actually take, then they start to feel it.
Mm.
And if I actually wanted them to feel it even more fully, we'd have some of them asking questions while we're going, and I'd be responding to those in real time.
Mm,
And you're their surrogate. You're acting on their behalf. And so I'm trying to answer your questions as honestly and truthfully and completely as I possibly can, in the hope that it comes across that I have, benevolence, integrity, and ability.
ability, right. Wow. Wow, absolutely. And that transparency, it comes back to that word too, man, where that's so important. I love how you talk about how leaders should be building a culture of trust, and you've got some really specific advice for leaders to build that, not just in the whole company, but just in their space, right, in their store.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that, Darryl.
So for me, I think it goes back to this notion of sharing some of the challenges so that we reduce uncertainty. Um, Leaders there are things that drive success for leaders. And I think that trust is one of the primary ones that does that. And it's one of the few that's actually within their control. And so what I do is I systematically walk people through these different levers and how to pull them, right? We talked about the integrity lever. The places that we fall down on integrity is when we overcommit. Um, and we have a tendency to want to do that, particularly when things go wrong, or when we've made a commitment and someone else hears something different, right? And so we haven't been clear and shared.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times what I'll get people to do is I'll get them to say, do you remember when I told you this is what was going to happen? This is me doing it. And now that's me finishing it. Do we have, are we in alignment around, I just did what I said I was going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other piece around integrity is that we interpret the world through stories. And if we're not involved in the creation of that story, then sometimes our decisions and our actions can be misinterpreted. It can look like hypocrisy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it can look like, oh, there's one set of rules for one folk and another set of rules for others. And so we need to be including people in that conversation all the way along.
Mm-hmm.
Even when we talk about ability, it's our favorite lever, but we massively underdefine what good looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And so having conversations around what does a good leader look like for you? What does excellence look like in terms of how I help you grow and develop within this organization? Um, and what are my expectations for you? What does good look like for you? And being aware that for both of us, it's going to be a moving target,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because what made a great leader a decade ago probably doesn't today,
No.
right?
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Wow.
So did that answer the question?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's I think building the awareness first
Right.
for leaders is so important because everything that you've talked about, if I don't have a good emotional intelligence, if I don't realize how my actions affect others, I can't go to the place that you're going. So
Right.
um I'll come back to asking you for some final hints and tips for new leaders in a second, but I want to ask this because I can remember my days as a district manager when I would talk to people and they would say, I just don't trust my store manager anymore. And
Right.
the first thing that they would say is that, they don't show up. They say they're going to be here. They say they're going to do this with me. Today was the day we were supposed to have our one-on-one. It never happened. They never apologized for it. How do leaders get more awareness and then be able to, kind of backtrack and rebuild that trust and how
Yeah.
to convince them that that's so important?
Well, part of the challenge here is that the role of leadership is becoming increasingly complex.
Yes.
Being a good leader is hard,
Yeah.
right? And it feels like it needs to evolve from being a sole practitioner effort to being a team sport.
Mm,
Um, and so a lot of times what happens with leaders, I was talking with a group of senior executives and I said, let's talk about ability. Have you clearly defined what it is? Well, sort of. And do you communicate that to other parts of the organization so that they have a sense of what you think excellence is? And have you included them in the conversation so that you get a sense of what they think excellence is? And said, yeah, we've done none of that. Okay.
wow.
How about integrity? Are you following through on your commitments? And they said, we each have 500 unread emails in our inbox.
Wow.
We're just overwhelmed. We're swamped. We can't keep up. And and what people see is the symptoms of that. They don't understand the narrative of what's going on with that or why it's happening. And and we started to talk about benevolence, and they said, well, we can't even go there, right? We're just not even comfortable talking about that. And so I think a lot of times what we need to be doing as leaders is being clearer about what the constraints are, how we're constrained,
Mm-hmm.
being clear about, our intent versus our ability to follow through, um, being careful about the commitments and promises that we're making. So I think that's a big part of the challenge, particularly when we're in the middle and we're getting bombarded with things that are outside our control.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we can create what we want to create is a safe harbor for our employees. And a lot of times, I've worked with a lot of tech companies where you get people who have incredible technical skills. They're brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And they get promoted into a leadership role where they're supposed to have people skills, and they're kind of like, I I don't understand people,
Yeah.
right? They're a mystery to me.
Yes.
And and so they've gone through my book and through the training, the master class, and those kinds of things, and they've come back and said, it's like you gave me a formula.
Mm.
Now I actually know and I'm having success. And so it's possible to get there. Part of the challenge is, this lack of awareness,
Yes.
right? So when we ask people, who do you trust? We get these close, tight personal relationships, best friends, parent, spouse, siblings, and it's where our head goes. But the reality is we trust people all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's how society functions. It's a social lubricant that allows us to function.
Mm-hmm.
And so once we start to raise that awareness, people start to become aware of, oh yeah, I do trust, you know, the mailman. If he knocks on the door, I'm going to open the door. And I do trust my doctor, and I do trust the local uh, pharmacy, and
Mm-hmm.
those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
When I flip the question and I say, who trusts you? I get this long pause,
Yes.
right? And then people say, well, how on earth would I know? Well, if I'm a leader, I'm asking myself, the definition is a willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. How can the people I lead make themselves vulnerable to me?
Mm. Wow.
They can make choices about whether they share bad news with me. They can push back against ideas they don't think are going to work. They can ask questions. They can be creative and innovative, be willing to make mistakes. They can tell me what their real development needs are, be open and honest with me. Those are all ways that they can make themselves vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
The question becomes, do they? Because if they do, they trust you.
Yeah.
If they don't, they don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. And it all starts with you asking the question, right?
Right.
Yeah. It all starts with you asking the question. And you answered the last question I was going to ask you was what would be two or three pieces of advice for new leaders. You just answered that, and that's where they have to go. That awareness is so key. But once they have that, to go down that road that you went down, and I'm going to ask you to talk about your book in a second and how
Right.
we can contact you. Then it's going to fall into place. It's such a different perspective, on trust and thinking about people that sometimes say it was run through my mind. I unfortunately know some people that say, "Yeah, I don't trust anything. I don't trust." Wait a second, you don't trust your doctor. You don't trust that you're gonna go to the movies and the movie's gonna come on. I mean, come on. There's some things that you trust.
Right. Or that the person behind you isn't going to do something terrible to you, or
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
or that you go to a restaurant, you don't go into the kitchen and see where they got the food and
e-
how they cook it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're talking about just taking that to that different level, uncertainty, vulnerability. I mean, it all makes so much sense. Darryl, this was amazing. And you gave exactly what I knew you were going to give. And thank you so much. But I have to first say, man, tell everybody the title of your book and how they can get it and how they can contact you and work with you.
Right. So the book is called Building Trust: Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World.
Mm.
You can find it anywhere online. So Amazon or Barnes and Noble or anywhere you order books online. It's available as a hardcover, an ebook, or an audiobook. I also have a master class that's about 3 hours in length. It's 35-minute segments. A lot of people are talking about trust, but they're not talking about what to do about it. And
Mm.
I'm one of the few that's actually giving you step-by-step instructions about, here's how you pull these levers. Here's how you ask these questions. And so the aspiration is to make the world a better place, Ken.
Yeah. No,
And,
no doubt.
one step at a time. So
Yeah.
people can go to my website, trustunlimited.com. You can also find a link to the book there. You can also find the masterclass in the courses section. Been getting remarkable responses on the masterclass and the book. It's really intended to be a practical guide, and it's intended to scale this work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That is fantastic. I ordered my book, so I can't wait to get it. And you've just opened my eyes to just so many different things and so many different levels of trust, and the awareness as I was reading about you and reading some things that you talk about has just really really built. So this has been amazing, Darryl. I want to thank you. I'll make sure all of that is in the show notes so people will know and have the link to go directly into the site. But thank you so much for being so generous with your time and really just being so caring and wanting our workplace and our world to just get a little better. Like you said, one person at a time.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
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 Well, thank you for sharing your audience with me and for the time that you spent with me. I really appreciate it, Ken.
My pleasure. My pleasure. So, folks, this has been the Leading from the Middle podcast with Kenny and with Darryl. Talk to you real soon.